Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's office hours. I'm Jennifer Splansky-Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining. Also, you'll see Paul Schmitz on the line, who I'll do a formal intro of in just a few minutes. But before we go any further, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous land that we are all joining from. Although we're meeting virtually, we believe that it's important to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from Indigenous territory, and we honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we reside. We'd like to acknowledge that this session is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Menominee, Ohlone, Coast Salish, Suquamish, and Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the tribes and people of these lands. Thank you. We would also like to invite you to participate in our land acknowledgement and let us know the lands that you are on in the chat box. So if that is something that you know, please go ahead and put that in the chat. If you're not sure and you're based in the US and Canada, you can use the information on the screen to find out where you're joining from. So you have a URL here and you can enter your location at native-land.ca, or you can text your city and state or your zip code to the number here on the screen. I'll give folks a few minutes to do that and say thank you to Code for Anchorage for developing this project that enables the text and the text service to figure out what lands you're on.
Thanks, everyone.
Terrific. Just give it another moment. All right, well, feel free to keep putting that in as we go. But I'm going to walk through a few more nuts and bolts before I hand it over to Paul. So this is structured today as we're calling it in office hours, and what we have 60 minutes together. Paul will share some thoughts up front, and then we'll spend the majority of our time in Q&A. And just one note on Q&A, please do use the Q&A box on the webinar platform, which is a different box from the chat box. That just makes it easier for us to identify the questions. Feel free to use the chat for communicating with other participants on the line, but do please share your questions in the Q&A box because that's where we will be moderating them from. We are recording today's session and it will be made available hopefully within about 24 hours, and we'll send an email out with a link once it is available. Feel free to tweet information here on the screen if you are so inspired. And then finally, you may have already noticed that we have live captioning turned on during today's event. They are turned on automatically, and if you wish to turn them off, you can go to the live transcript button on your webinar platform and choose hide subtitles. We're including live captions as an increased accessibility measure, but if you are finding it distracting, no problem to turn it off on your end. Finally, for technical assistance, you can use the question box, or you can email my colleague Tracy Timmons-Gray, who is running the Zoom platform behind the scenes. And thank you, Tracy, for supporting the technology for today's session. All right, so I am going to stop the screen share and do a formal introduction of my colleague, Paul Schmitz. Several of you on the line have probably met Paul or been on webinars or listened to him on our podcasts. But if this is the first time where you'll be meeting Paul, you're in for a treat. Paul is a senior advisor to the Collective Impact Forum and leads his own consulting firm called Leading Inside Out. Paul builds the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater impact. He is an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant whose work focuses on leadership development, collaborative culture, racial equity, community engagement, and results-based strategies. He is also the author of the book, Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up, which is based on lessons learned from 21 years leading Public Allies, an innovative leadership development program that helped thousands of passionate and diverse young leaders across the country begin careers working for community and social change. I'm delighted to have Paul with me. And Paul, I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Tracy. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. For the last couple of years, I've been working through kind of a list of what I kind of consider the worst practices of collective impact. And there are things that, as I've visited, a couple hundred projects over the years, I tend to see the same patterns, the same things. And when I get brought in as a consultant, I find often it's the same things as well that are kind of wrong or not working right. And so I've kind of compiled that list. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through those 10 things briefly, and then I'm going to take your questions. And I should note that I'm a parent of teenagers. And one of the things about being a parent of teenagers is that they are really into memes. And my daughter helped me design this using some of the popular memes. But we've got 10 dangers to collective impact, kind of worst practices to avoid. And just a warning that doing these things might cause a lot of stress. And let's go to the first. And the first one is strategy drift, which is we don't follow our strategic plan. Now, of course, when we measure success and gather data, we may make adaptations. But what I see often is groups that have plans that are result-based, that are measurable, and then all of a sudden they're doing something new, or they have some new idea and they're doing something that's completely off strategy. Or my favorite, my colleague's favorite right now is a couple groups working with that have developed podcasts, because that's something I guess everyone's trying to do now. But doing things that are just off strategy. And so when we drift away from our core strategy, if we have a rigorous strategy that's really aimed at our population level results and our system changes and how to move them, again, there is adaptation, but too often what I see is people not living up to the rigor of their plan.
Hey, Paul, just a technical
Yes.
note. We're seeing your outline view, not your presentation view.
Oh, hold on.
You might want to do your screen share again. Yep.
Let's go here. Let me get, sorry. Let's try that again. Let's go here. Slideshow. All right. Are you seeing it now?
No.
It says sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. I've never had this happen. Hold on. My apologies. I do
No
these all the
worries.
time. I've never had an issue with running a slideshow on PowerPoint within Zoom. So let's, I'm going to try it one more time this way. And it still says sharing is paused. I'm going to go to share the desktop and see if that makes it different.
Yep.
I'm going to bring it back. Now are you seeing it?
Yes, we see the 10 dangers to collective impact.
Okay.
You might want to just stretch it out. We can see a little bit of your background, but we do see the proper slide.
Okay. Weird. I've never had this happen. We have to figure this out. Thank you, everyone.
Sure.
After I was giving compliments. So strategy drift is the first. Again, when we've got a clear strategic plan, when we've got results and strategies and measures, and we start doing other things because they're cool or interesting. And often there are things that aren't like, that are more popular and don't require us to make hard choices, which is what strategy often does. Strategy is about what you say no to. And when we're saying yes to everything, we drift. The second is culture drift, which is we begin our process, we develop this meeting style, we do check-ins, we have really inclusive process, and then we drift back into the old habits of lots of reporting, and we don't have time because we have so much to share that we don't check in anymore, and we stop doing things that make the culture work. We stop those practices, we stop the relationship building, we don't do any like We did some early on community building with the first group, and we never come back to it. We never do it again. And the culture just drifts. We lose the trust, we lose the relationships, we lose the connection, and the meetings and process become monotonous. The third is treating work groups like committees. That I always use the example when I do my workshops on meetings is that collective impact meetings should never be around a giant table. That to me, that rewards extroverts. It rewards people with power. It does not support collaborative work. We need to be around tables, and our work group meetings should be based on getting action commitments and alignment, and we should be problem solving together in small groups in meetings to advance our strategies. And too often what I see is work groups become committee meetings, and they become filled with reports. And again, like the culture, they just become monotonous and boring. And why should I go? I could just read it in an email or talk to someone afterward versus being in a room where I'm actually solving problems and working through challenges we're facing and deliberating and debating and making decisions and working in groups. That's what work groups should be, not committees. Wrong people at the table. And there's kind of two ways that wrong people show up. First, and maybe most obviously, is in terms of demographics and how reflective and representative our table is of the populations we're working with and the communities we're working in. But also that sometimes what happens is we begin the table with one group of people, and then as we advance the work, we kind of forget that we should be building the table around the work we're doing. So if I'm building a table, if I'm building a collective impact to increase enrollment in early childhood education, as an example, and my first table that designs this is all people who work for those early childhood people, that's great. But then if our job is enrollment, what we need at the table is people who know people and people who can help us recruit people. And so tables evolve, they shift, they change. And the question should always be, who do we need at the table to contribute to our results and strategies? And too often it's just we sit on who was there first instead of evolving the table and making sure it's reflective, representative, and it's the people needed and whose work back at their agencies is germane to our strategy. The fifth is lack of inclusive transparency. And this really shows up in a few ways. One is when you've got like factions within a collective impact, when there's meetings before the meeting that are kind of the real meeting, and some people know information, others don't. And there's a grant process, but only some people know about it. But also in terms of really doing that continual composition analysis and asking yourself, who's showing up at our meetings, who's not showing up at our meetings, who do we need to be following up with, making that outreach, making people feel welcome. If they're not there, following up and seeing how you can engage them, really being inclusive in the best sense of the word, of making people feel welcome, connected, important, being transparent in your process so that there's not like different information getting to different people, and doing all of that in support of trust and also having, again, that inclusivity. The lack of accountability, and there was a group I worked with a few years ago when I was doing these interviews, and someone said, we make decisions and they go away. And I always like that because I feel I've been to a lot of meetings where that happens, where we, at the end of the meeting, say, oh, these are the things that need to happen, who can do these things. And then we go to the next meeting, there's a different agenda, and we're talking about the next work, and no one knows like what actually happened. And therefore, I don't have to do it. And I see a lot of groups where the backbone ends up doing all the work because they're not sharing, they're not organizing meetings around action commitments, they're not holding people accountable, and they're not creating space for people to do that. And so, I always suggest with collective impacts at the end of every meeting, walk through the action commitments, email them out to everyone afterward, let people know, check in with them a week before the next meeting. Have you done your action commitments? And then begin each meeting reviewing the action commitments, doing what you need to do, and also being accountable to your measures and results. Use those measures to say, listen, like we're not seeing the same impact here as we're seeing over here. So maybe we need to shift resources. And again, use that to guide strategy, but make sure there's accountability in the system as well as the inclusion. Funder and political hijacking. One of my favorite stories here was a city agency that did a 2-year planning process around an issue with all these groups and residents and community. And then the mayor went to a conference and came back and wanted to announce some big new idea he heard about at a conference that had nothing to do with the 2 years of planning. Or you see a funder come out with a new funding, and all of a sudden the collective impact is like, even though it's not part of their strategy, going for that because it's money. And what we start to do is allowing ourselves to be hijacked by others' agenda. The goal of having a common agenda is that it's something that's been thought through, that's rigorous, that's planned, and not letting it get hijacked. And I think it's important also that our collective impact effort on our steering committee or on our board or somewhere, we better have people who have the kind of influence with the formal influence and authority with people like a mayor or funders who can help prevent that from happening and intercede when it does happen. The eighth is managing a network like an organization. And the metaphor I always use here is I've seen backbone organizations start to act like a Hilton when in fact they're an Airbnb. That they start to think that the work is that they start treating the backbone as if the leader is the CEO of the collective impact, and start treating it as a hierarchy, start treating it as start worrying about their own credit and the organization's branding and funding and everything else, and they become really focused on the organization. And they often put people on their board who are used to traditional boards and asking those same questions, when really what you're doing is you're managing a network. And to manage a network is a very different thing than managing an organization. And you're responsible for an ecosystem, and the people you bring on your steering committee or board have to think in an ecosystem way, not an organization way. And to be able to hold the ecosystem's health, not the organization's health. The CEO of BoardSource just did a great article in Stanford Social Innovation Review on purpose-based governance, and really talks about this as well. But it's something that I see a lot of groups do, is the backbones, and it's often pushed by their board. They recruit board members who have power, and what they're used to is their mental models are all based on organization. So they start saying, well, no, the CEO should have a vision, not, and they start forgetting that it was a network that created a common agenda, and they move away from a network-centric view to an organization-centric view. Insufficient time frame. That there are collective impacts that have achieved quick successes, especially in the pandemic. I've seen collective impact teams here that have had 6-month goals and achieved them, right? But really, when we're trying to move major system and population level change, it's a 5 to 10 year proposition usually. And too often we build around like 2-year planning cycles and other things and funding cycles. And we've got to, if we're going to commit to collective impact, we've got to commit long term. When we look at those places that have moved the needle, it takes time. It often takes 1 or 2 years just to get like the right people at the table, the right agenda, get everything together. And so we need time to build it. And too often we don't do that. And finally, a lack of adaptive leadership. And to me, this shows up in 3 ways. One is that we try to form too simple solutions to complex problems. We don't engage the system. We don't think of like how all the pieces come together. And we start kind of like acting like issues are one-offs and you can do one thing or find that silver bullet response or evidence-based program, versus understanding the complexity we're dealing in and that we need to address. The second is adaptive leadership in terms of collaborative problem solving. And what does it mean to have the skills to work with a group of diverse people to make hard choices together? And finally, it's difficult conversations, which is it builds on that. But all those are adaptive leadership skills that are too often lacking in organizations. They want to keep everything polite. They don't want to have tension in the group. They don't want to have difficult conversations. They don't want to make hard choices. And then they end up doing like the simplest things because that's what everyone can agree with, instead of engaging the complexity. So those are the 10 things I've kind of found most often get in the way of progress on collective impact. And happy now to stop and take questions from the group and hear what some of yours are. And again, if you've got other ones that I should be tracking, I'd love it. This list has shifted a little bit over the last 2 years as people have brought things. It was Jennifer, in fact, who brought the insufficient time frames to my attention after I did this a couple of years ago at a conference. And I had 8, and that added the 9th. And John Cania got me thinking about the 10th recently. And so happy to hear both your feedback and your questions on this, because to me, it's an evolving thing that I'm hoping to write up soon. So happy to hear from folks.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks for sharing this really as what you're learning and seeing in partnership with the folks you're working with in the field. Most importantly, the practitioners really doing the work. Already have lots of questions coming in. And so I will just start working our way through them. Paul, what do you think are the best ways to keep all the stakeholders informed, especially when the task normally does fall on overstretched staff members? So that's from Catherine.
So, I mean, I think that again, it's like, how are you building the communication mechanism and kind of cultural practices within the group? So, how are meetings used to transmit information? How are you transmitting to different groups? Are you pulling together? Are you doing the one-on-one outreach or small group conversations as well as kind of like sending emails? Um, you can't do everything, and I get that people are stretched, but we also have to remember that like not everyone responds the same way to like long emails or written communication, and some people hear and learn things differently. And so I think just like really building agreements in the group on how best people would prefer to get information, and then having not just relying on one way to communicate, I think is important.
Hmm. Yeah. Someone was asking if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between 5 and 6, lack of inclusive transparency and lack of accountability.
Yeah, and the inclusive transparency is like, how are you making a group where everyone feels like they're a contributor, and where if I'm a community resident with lived experience, I don't feel like I'm at the kids' table. And if I'm a small grassroots organization and there's a larger, kind of more institutional organization at the table, like you're not listening to the institutional and blowing off my feedback, right? Like, so how are you facilitating in a way that's both transparent and inclusive, where everyone feels like their contributions are valued? Those contributions may be different because people bring different authority and levels, but that's talked about in the group. And again, I think that one of the things I talk about a lot is that when I talk about collaboration, is just that like a lot of times we talk about like people having interests as a bad thing. It's kind of an obvious thing. Like if I am the CEO of an organization, I'm kind of paid to be interested in my organization, and my board wants me to care about my organization's interests. So let's talk about those and negotiate those in the room rather than complain that someone's self-interested when we're out of the room. And so to me, that inclusive transparency is trying to really create that space where people all feel like there's a fair process that's neutrally led, where everyone's voice is heard. And then to me, the accountability is about how are you making sure that what you're committing to do individually and collectively is being tracked, is being supported, and getting done. And it's not a shame-based practice. It's more a practice to do it. I give the example in my meetings workshop about a group I worked with where I was actually co-chair of one of the work groups, and they began this process where after every meeting they sent an email with like these columns, and one column was the action commitment, who's responsible for it, when they're going to do it, and why it's important to our results. And then they'd send it a few weeks later again, and then they'd email the people who made commitments, say, is there any help you need getting this done before the next meeting? And then a week before the next meeting, you get an email saying you're going to be reporting back on this. Now those emails like take some time, but not a lot of time. But there's no way you could come to the meeting and be like, I forgot I was supposed to do that. You got hit like 3 or 4 times between meetings with a reminder that you had made that commitment. And then the next meeting began with reviewing the action commitments from the last meeting and what happened. And that way it allows that kind of accountability. And then I think the other thing is accountability on the strategies. I see groups build strategies and metrics, but they're not using them to manage the process. They're not looking and saying, hey, these schools we're seeing an increase, these we are not. How do we adapt our process to get to these ones? Like using that to say that there's accountability, again, not as a means of reporting, but that like we're actually going to like, we're trying to move our result, and therefore measuring and being accountable to moving that together and to adapting our work to make that happen. And that kind of starts to fall into the strategy drift, and then it falls into the culture drift as well.
Yeah. And sticking on this accountability thread, Paul, someone asked, Shelly asks, could you please talk about project management versus holding accountability? The way she asked it is, how deep does the backbone sink into tracking the details of action commitments to help ensure alignment and integration of actions in between meetings? So kind of getting into the backbone role. You gave some examples, but I often hear this tension, like how much is the backbone holding, doing versus holding accountable to other actions. I'm
Right.
reading a little bit of that in the question.
Right. I mean, I have clients right now who have this issue of like the backbone ends up doing everything. And I think the challenge is, again, the more you can create a transparent work plan and have people owning commitments and understand why they're important and that we're all agreed that these are the things that need to happen to move our result, the easier it is to hold that. And I think project management is a big piece of the role. And but the goal is to be facilitating and supporting others to do the work and not doing all the work ourselves. And that's why it's harder. I'm one of those who it's often easier for me just to do it than to like support someone to do it, right? But if we do that, then we start building the habit and expectation that people don't have to do anything. And so it's like a lot of things that are kind of good for you, but like take a little work up front and then pay off later down. You end up doing more early on and supporting people to do that, but then you build a culture where everyone knows that when you're in this group, you do work. And if you let it slide all the time, then you do it. So I do think project management's a big piece of it, but it's also just, again, it's trying to keep people moving forward and keeping within the culture that balance of both inclusivity and accountability, both.
Mhm. Paul, a couple of folks have asked for, you mentioned a Stanford Social Innovation Review article.
Mm.
Is that the original article, Collective Impact, or did you reference a
No, I
different
was
article?
talking about a new one. It's a very new. Let me find the name of it. Um, I think it's called Purpose-Based Governance, but I
Mm,
will have the name in like one moment. Um, Wrong folder. So um, there was just it was just in like really recently um, in there. And it's a article about governance, and it has a few different pieces, but one of them is about like the need for governance today to be thinking of the ecosystem and not just thinking of the organization. And that's what I found especially helpful in thinking about kind of collective impact, and what I've seen with like boards who often just don't get that part of it and start to think that, you know, their job is only to think about the organization, and they don't get that they're like responsible for an entire ecosystem. And
mm,
so I'll have that name in a moment, but that's the I thought it was a great article, and it's by the CEO of it's called of the Four Principles of Purpose-Driven Board Leadership by Ann Wallstad. It was in March of this year in SSIR.
great.
And Wallstead is Wallestad, and it's the Four Principles of Purpose-Driven Board Leadership.
Terrific. And
Um,
Tracy
so
just put the
yeah,
link in
great.
the chat if anyone wants to click
Thanks,
through
Tracy.
directly. Yes, real time. Thank you. Awesome. Let's see. So many good questions. So there are a couple of questions here, Paul, that are asking about a little bit going deeper on the role of the backbone and
Mm,
guidance for how the backbone can exert leadership and influence to ensure, for example, that collective impact efforts don't fall into these dangers. And
mm,
another, perhaps similar thread of a question around, in particular, when the backbone is coordinating a very quote high level group of
mm.
stakeholders, how do they exert this kind of influence without authority?
Yeah. So great questions. Um, so the second one's kind of hitting me first, and I'm going to ask you to remind me of the first. But the I think if you don't have the authority to move the people on your group, you need a champion in that group who holds the space for you to do that. So, um, so you might, if you don't have the authority, but there's someone on your steering committee or board who completely is bought into your process, they can help hold the space for you, and they can help kind of keep the people at the table kind of moving in the right direction. And so if you don't have the authority yourself, you better have someone who has that authority kind of championing and backing up the group. The other part of that, if I'm recalling, is really about the role of the backbone in the way I see it is to kind of hold is to be holding both the agenda and the process. And if I'm holding that, my job is all about kind of, in result-based facilitation, they call it the container, but my job is to support the container. It's a servant leadership role. And what I should be doing is creating a container in which people can do their work together, and that supports the kind of collaboration, inclusion, accountability that we need to move forward. And that keeps people aligned around that. And again, there's a lot of cultural tricks that are important in terms of like really building, I often say that if I'm running a collective impact, I want to create a meeting that when people walk into my meeting, it's different than every other meeting they walk into. And when they walk in, they know what it is. And it like works the same way each time. And it has its own culture. And when people walk in, they know this is different. And again, I'm trying to create a space that is our space that works a certain way. And I think the servant leadership aspect of this is so important because, again, my job's not to be the authoritative directing people. My job is to be supporting people to achieve what we've agreed. And I think, again, if we've got a common agenda, it means an agenda created by people they've agreed to. I've got to hold that. And when I'm holding that, I'm not holding my interest, I'm holding their interest. And if I'm holding people accountable to that common agenda or to the core values we've agreed on, I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it because that's something the group agreed to, and I serve the group. And so if the group agrees to that, I can hold people accountable to that, but it's not because of, it's my idea that we agreed to. It's you decided to do it. So we've got to commit. We've committed to this. We've got to do what we've committed to do.
Great. Maybe just a follow-on kind of tactical question. Is there a limit to the number of partners at a table, or what's a sweet spot?
So again, I don't like the one table meetings. Like I like small tables of 4 to 6 and having multiple tables. And so I think you can have, I think there's like, so another thing I think is really important in collective impact that to me is one of my core beliefs is that form follows function. And that too often I see people take what have been called the 5 conditions. I hate the word conditions also because it makes it sound like prescriptive. And they treat it like a formula. And they'd be like, well, we've gotten this and this and this. And I'm like, no. What's the result you're trying to move? What are the strategies necessary to move that result? Who's all needed to do that? And how are you organizing yourself with an agenda, with measurement, with engagement, with alignment to do all that? And who's backboning it, right? Like, so it's not to me, so to me, there's not like a right number. It's like, what's the number needed to move what you're moving in the community you're in? And so to me, a great steering committee has uncommon allies, people who, if different stakeholders who may have different interests in the ecosystem look at it, there's someone everyone trusts. And in different communities, that might look different. On different issues, it might look different. I've seen effective steering committees with like 7 or 8 people. I've seen ones with 35 people. And like, depending on context, each of them have been good. So I think it's really about like having the work. I think too often we kind of build the collective impact architecture and then kind of decide what it's going to do. And I kind of believe you build an initial draft architecture, decide what you're doing, and then you're going to build the real architecture around what you're actually doing. So to me, form always follows function, not the other way.
Thanks, Paul. Form follows function, definitely. Yes, I think people often get caught up, as you said, in like the structure. Sometimes it's not, sometimes Paul say, you can't forget about the impact. If you focus too much on the collective, you're going to lose sight of the impact.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a balance.
Yeah. So I really appreciate this question from Alexander. One thing I've seen during the pandemic, especially, is collective impact groups designed for long-term systemic changes, addressing short-term, more emergency concerns. When does the approach of making real achievements on pressing issues become a potential strategy drift or fall into a danger zone?
Can you ask that again? I'm
Yes. I will paraphrase.
yeah.
Especially in the time of the pandemic, though not necessarily always, collectives who had been focused on big picture system change have
Mm,
done more time sensitive, responsive
yep.
action
Yeah.
based on pressing needs. And
Yeah.
how how do you hold that intention with like not falling into strategy drift?
Yeah, great question. And first I'll say I highly endorse. I've endorsed many collective impacts that have gone off strategy this year to take care of the most urgent needs of vulnerable populations. And to me, that's not strategy drift. That's we're in a crisis that's unprecedented in our history, and like people are suffering. We got to do what they need, and we'll get back and we'll migrate back. And so I actually wrote a paper on Milwaukee's response to COVID through 7 collective impact groups. And I've seen groups do amazing things off strategy. Those aren't, to me, drifts. Those are intentional choices to basically pause strategy and take care of immediate needs because people are in crisis. And I think that's a unique situation. And again, as long as it's intentional and we understand, like, this is the pause, this is what we're doing, and this is how we'll migrate back, then it's an intentional choice. But if we're sliding into that and sliding away and pretending the strategy we had doesn't exist anymore, that's a different thing. The other thing is we see people learning things from the crisis that are helping them adapt their strategy as they come back, as we look at what's a new normal for our work. And people have had to do forced innovations as a result of COVID. And they're like, well, this actually works better, or we could include this. So, like groups working on mental health are like, telehealth is a real tool we have access to now. And if we can make sure that insurance keeps paying for it, that may open up doors for us that didn't exist before. And so our strategy may adapt. But that's different than drift. Drift is we've decided is the inability to say no, and the moving away from things that have measures with them that we're kind of afraid, in a way, afraid to be accountable for. So we do the lower hanging things that seem easier, or we do things that seem like everyone gets excited about that have more flash than substance. So we do some kind of like PR campaign or something that everyone gets excited about, but we're not like doing the harder, grittier work that's involved. I think the shift to, in a crisis, make an intentional choice to take a pause and do something else is absolutely, like, again, I saw amazing things happen here with collective impacts that did that. And I'm glad they did. And I know that they all plan to migrate back to their strategies as we move into the new normal.
Yeah. And in ways I think that are probably informed by um, what the work over the last year, right? It's not going back to the exact
Absolutely.
same.
Right.
Yeah. So kind of sticking with the current times, Susan asks, do you have any tips for holding these types of conversations like the small tables in Zoom? I find that so many of these that I have attended, we have 1 or 2 person breakout rooms, even with prompts, and the structure is not super conducive to work actually getting started, let alone done.
Yeah. So my partner Dominique Samari and I, in a few cases, um, one client recently, we basically like are dividing their steering committee meeting into 2 meetings, so we can have more intimate, deeper conversations with 2 groups, and then connect it all and let people know. Um, that's when they're not making decisions. And we've also, using small groups but facilitating them, not just like putting people in groups, and like having enough people in a group where you can have a conversation. But again, I think organizing a meeting around clear results, like what are the action commitments we need to walk out of a meeting with, and knowing what those are beforehand, so your meetings are organized around action, not reporting. And then, like, knowing what we're trying to solve for in the meeting, and not meeting unless you've got something really to solve for or some actions you need to align and get people to commit to. And then I think small groups can be great. Sometimes those small groups can be self-facilitated. Sometimes the backbone needs to facilitate each of the small groups. And sometimes we can split up meetings and do the meeting twice for two different groups, like just so that we can like have more intimate and deeper conversations that we can't have when we have 25 people on the Zoom. So we
Yeah.
do 12 people ones, and then we break those into two groups, but like we combine it all up, but that way we can get deeper and better work out of people. So I think it's a lot of it, we're all experimenting and figuring out too.
Another technique that I've found helpful is giving people like a template to fill out, recording a little
Yeah.
bit about their conversation or naming their action items or commitments from their
Right.
breakout room. So you could have like a Google Doc. It's a very
That's what we've been doing is I
technology-backed
call them Google flip
solution.
charts now, but
Yeah.
basically like I'm using Google Slides, and I basically treat each slide like it's a piece of flip chart paper. And I'll put kind of like text boxes on them in different colors, like they're post-it notes, and set it up in a way with questions so that like people like will report back. And so like I've like using that all the time with clients now, and then sometimes using Jamboard, but usually I'm just using Google Slides and just using those as if they're like flip chart paper, and having people take notes and report back, and kind of setting up the template to make it easy and people know what they need to enter into different spaces. And then again, like trying to capture information better. And again, trying to make sure the questions will yield real choices and options and discussion versus kind of really open-ended things that kind of just are like, really getting people clear on what we want to walk out of that with. What do we need from the group in that breakout?
Mhm.
Not just a cool conversation, but we need like stuff that'll help us make a decision on this or options for doing this. And again, the more we can make the questions precise, the better the groups can respond to them.
Great, great. These questions just keep coming. They're great. Do you have any advice, Paul, for reinvigorating a collective that has been historically mismanaged?
The first is you have to own where it's been. Like, because if people have that feeling like it hasn't been working and you don't acknowledge that that's real, then people are going to think you're maybe full of it. So I think to build trust, you have to kind of own that, like, listen, we recognize the way the process worked in the 1.0 of this just has not been well. And we've listened to you, and what we've heard are here's some of the things that aren't happening. So our commitment is to design the process going forward to do these three things that we heard from you all weren't working before. And here's how we're going to do that. And we want to hear back from you. And so I think like build a formal bridge instead of just like pretend things are different, like narrate the difference. Like, here's where we were, here's where we're going, here's how we're doing it. I had a client a few years ago where this is exactly what we did. In fact, the Making Meetings Work webinars and meetings and the blog I've done, which are on the forum website, are based primarily on that one client where it was managed well before, and we had to shift the culture and shift the work. And but we listened to people about what wasn't working, and then we designed to solve for those things. And we let them know that, like, here's what you said wasn't working, here's how we're going to improve on these things, and we want your feedback so we can continue to improve it. So I think, like, again, making that acknowledgement so that people know you like aren't pretending like the past didn't happen, but that you're building a bridge to something new and walking them over that bridge.
Nice, nice. I'm going to shift gears a little to one of the other dangers, Paul, and that is about managing the collective like a organization.
Mm.
And Ryan asked, I'd love to hear more about managing a network like an ecosystem as an ED of an organization and the convener of a collective impact effort.
Yeah.
How do we not fall into that trap?
Yeah. So
Great
the book
question.
that gave me the metaphor I used was actually New Power by Henry Timms and Jeremy Hyman. And I'm not, it's funny. It's a book I kind of have mixed feelings about because I feel it's a little glib in places, but I think that overall, the notion of like we've got to think differently, and we can't apply old models of organizational behavior to the way we work now, which is much more networked. And I do think there's ways to think differently, and metaphors we can use to help our more traditional board members or authority figures, to help them start to think differently about it. That's why I use that Hilton Airbnb, because I found that metaphor works with people. But I think that and again, I think that Ann Wallstead article could be a helpful resource to think about that. But to me, I think the key is understanding that like our job is to pursue that purpose. And so whatever the results or system changes are that our collective impact is aimed at, whether it's reducing teen pregnancy or improving third grade reading scores or whatever it is, that's the purpose we're organized around. And we're governing an ecosystem, the ecosystem necessary to move that, the network we need in order for that to move, because no organization can move that alone. And so how do you have the locus of your thinking not to be on what's best for my organization, but what's best on the network? And a few years ago, there was a blog on the Collective Impact Forum where they interviewed like experienced backbones, and then they wrote a piece about like what they learned. But one of the things that was there is like the folks who were like successful longer term backbones were like, one of the things they were expected to get was giving credit to others and sharing credit, right? Which is a kind of system focused goal. And while, to be honest, if I'm an organization, I'm constantly giving credit to others, that's going to increase my credit. I mean, like, let's be real. Like, if people see us as someone who shares credit and supports others and builds others, that is going to, like, that doesn't hurt my organization. And I just think it's old thinking to think that if I'm like giving out and supporting others, like again, we got to get out of a competitive mindset and a scarcity mindset and into more of and into a different mindset, a more abundant mindset. Because if I'm trying to do this work, again, if I'm focused on the results, it's not about my organization, it's about the network needed to do that. And if I'm the backbone, my job is to build and support the network to do that. And if people see that we're behind the scenes, we're the intel inside, or whatever, again, metaphors you want to use, that's where we get our success. And again, I think that servant leadership, that it's like a 30 or 40-year-old leadership book by Robert Greenleaf, but the concept of servant leadership, it's like your role as leader is not to be the one in front making it happen. Your job as leader is to be the one supporting others to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the kind of key thing, is that great leaders are not those who are standing in front, like directing everyone. There's those pushing other people and supporting other people to get things done together. That's more than they believe they could do. Lao Tzu said the great leader is he or she, when they leave, the people think they did it themselves, right? Like, it's like, that's the kind of leadership it takes. And if you do that well, it shouldn't harm your organization, because people will know that you're the organization that can make things happen by pulling people together to do that.
Mm-hmm. Paul, do you see, along these lines, someone asked, do you see a downside to develop, or an upside to developing a communication strategy and branding around the network? So I will say, in my experience, I've seen, lots of collective impact efforts have their own, and a name, a brand, an identity of the collective that is distinct from any of the individual partner organizations. I don't know what you've seen, Paul. I've seen that.
And I'm going to go back to my default, which is form follows function on that, like what makes the most sense, because there's backbones that are spread across organizations, or backbones where it is the organization the only thing it does. There's backbones where it's a program of an organization that does other things. And so I think it's just, again, like what makes the most sense in your community that supports what you're trying to do. And in some cases, an organization might be so trusted and well regarded in this respect that it kind of is not necessarily in others. It might be like people really need to see its own brand so they feel like they're not controlled by someone else's agenda or whatever. And I think it's just like, be willing to give some of that up, because again, collaboration's choices, and it's also like sometimes we have to give things up to support each other, and credit's one of those things we have to be willing to do. And if you're really concerned about backbone credit, the best way to get backbone credit, again, I'll say, is be an awesome facilitator, network builder, and supporter, because that will build your brand more than anything else on the planet.
And so along those lines, Anne asks, when you are sort of servant leading from behind the scenes, giving others credit, how do you convince funders that you're making a difference?
Progress towards the result. So if like all you're doing is lots of meetings, that's one thing. If you're saying like, here's how we're moving progress across this network on these strategies, that's what funders care about. Funders aren't as concerned with the fact that like you like what they want to see is tangibly that like what you're doing in all of this is facilitating people to align their work to move strategies that hopefully are rigorous enough, and being measured in a way that you can see that you're making progress toward your ultimate outcome. And so if you're doing that and it's working, and again, recognizing that, yeah, maybe in the first year or two, you're more kind of hitting process milestones, but at some point you better be showing that like that process you're running is leading to actual results, that like you're making progress, that more kids are reading, or more kids are, fewer babies are dying, or whatever, again, the data points are that you're moving, that like you're able to demonstrate that success. Because that's ultimately what you don't exist to be a collective impact so that you can have meetings. You exist to move a result. And so progress on the results is what should matter. And whether an organization's doing it or a network's doing it, if you can show that like by bringing these groups together, we've done these strategies, and these strategies together have led to this result, that's what funders want to see.
Yep. And I've seen backbones take their partners with them into funder conversations to explain the role that the backbone has played in making progress toward those outcomes. So
Yeah.
where you have good relationships, trying to do that even with some of the partners can be really powerful.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm going to ask a question that we actually have a lot of time next week to talk about, but I think it's important to name in the context of the dangers. Is a question about racial dynamics and racial equity. How do
Yeah.
conveners and organizers ensure, collective organizers, I think not community organizers, ensure that power is equally distributed across all participants, especially those who are often ignored, people of color, people with disabilities, etc. And I will plug next week's office hours, where we will be going deeper on this topic as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And I highly recommend being with Junius and Sherry next week to talk more about that for a whole period. So I'm going to say something a little bit controversial to start, which is not everyone has equal power in the room. If the mayor is in the room, he or she has more power than a grassroots organizational leader. The question is whether the process is fair, whether the facilitators are neutral or at least honest brokers, and how you mitigate power imbalances. And so are you actually making those power imbalances real, or are you mitigating them? And so to me, if I'm running a fair process that truly is bringing different perspectives and empowering people and giving people real ability to lead from where they are and make contributions, that's what I can do. What I can't do is make a grassroots community leader more powerful than the mayor or than the CEO of some large foundation. What I can do is make sure that that person is not using their power in ways that benefit them or their interests over the group. I give the example in the meetings piece about like how we had a situation with a group where there were a couple executives from philanthropy who were dominating the meeting. So what we did is we assigned seats at meetings, and we put people with equivalent power, but we're inclusive with those people, and let them know that like, hey, so-and-so keeps dominating and kind of taking over. Can you help manage them? and we managed their power imbalance, right? And made a more inclusive conversation result. But like, you can assign seats, you can break people up, you can like, there's ways to mitigate the power imbalance. And then when it comes to like racial dynamics, I think like, as I talked about when I talked about the inclusive piece, is like, how are you doing continued composition analysis? So if you notice that like we're 6 months in, like the demographics we built our table with, is that still the demographics we have at our table? Who's not showing up? That tells us a lot. Who is showing up? How are people feeling included and involved? Are we checking in with people? Like, make sure that you're not just basing it on your perception, but you're checking in with people on how things are going and whether they're feeling heard and whether they're feeling engaged, whether they feel those imbalances are there. Like, there's lots you can do to check in, but also be watching your composition and see if like you're noticing any shifts. Like, the grassroots people aren't showing up anymore, or like we're noticing like none of our African American members are showing up, and like those are things that tell us something's wrong in the system that we need to deal with. And so pay attention to your composition, mitigate power imbalances. There's lots of tricks to do that. And you know, like I remember after one meeting where I turned to the director of this collective impact, I was like, that person's a problem. And she's like, yeah. I said, you need to go take that person to lunch and like help them understand that the impact they're having on this group, the way they're behaving and wielding their authority. And like that happened, and it actually did get better. But like, again, you've got to just like be aware of those dynamics and manage the dynamics and not just like let them fester.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Paul. I think that will be our last question for
All right.
today. We made it through a lot, and I apologize to those who we didn't get to your question, but tried to group them together as we were going. So I just want to thank you, Paul. That was like rapid fire. So you deserve a
It was
nap
fun.
after that. And definitely encourage folks to continue the conversation joining next week, where our colleagues Sherry Brady and Junice Williams will be going even deeper on the question of keeping equity at the center of collective impact efforts. I am going to just share my screen one last time for a few announcements. So in addition to joining us next week, we invite and welcome everyone to join us for the Collective Impact Action Summit, which is about 3 weeks away. This is our large annual conference. Used to be in person, but this is our second time doing it virtually. And we have, we're very delighted to have great speakers whose names are here on the screen lined up. I won't read them all off, but I know I'm looking forward to learning from all of these, as well as folks across the more than 20 breakout sessions over the course of 3 days. All sessions will be recorded. And so one of the silver linings of the doing the conferences virtually is you can actually watch them all on your own time after the event. So feel free to check that out, and we invite you to join us. And then if that is not enough, we wanted to make sure folks know that we have a podcast. So Paul made a little dig at podcasts earlier as a form of mission creep, but our mission is to bring advice to you all and connect you with learnings from the field. And so that's what we'll be doing through our Collective Impact podcast. We've been going at it for about a year, and so have over I believe over 20 episodes up and running. Some are more of the how-to nature, some are audio files from keynotes at convenings and things like that. So I invite you to log on and take a listen, and you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms. So with that, I will say thank you for joining us. Hope to see you next week on our office hours, and I wish you a healthy and well rest of your day and week. Take care.